So the first question that we sometimes ask is, are the wild-type tumors really GIST? Because a lot of you may think about GIST as being defined by having that KIT mutation or the PDGF receptor alpha mutation. So just to put that issue to rest, we really do think they're GIST. For the most part, they occur in the same locations, including the way that they spread. They look similar under the microscope, for the most part, and they have KIT on the surface of the cells. And we think that they arise from the same tissue in your body. So I'm going to use a few terms as I go through the talk, and I just wanted to define them. I think probably most of them you know these definitions, but just in case, I'm going to use the word inherited, which means that something is passed from one generation to the next in a family, or can be passed. It isn't necessarily passed. And it usually, when you're talking about something that's inherited, we're talking about a gene, and a gene is something in your body that sort of determines who you are, like what your hair color is or what your eye color is. So we're talking about a gene abnormality that's present in all the cells of the body, and then that can be passed from generation to generation. And then I'm going to use the word tumor predisposition syndrome, which generally means that there's a gene abnormality present in all the cells of the body that has the effect of increasing the risk of developing a particular type or particular types of cancer. And generally, for the ones that I'm going to talk about, everything else about the person is normal, even though they have a gene abnormality in all the cells of their body. Does anyone have questions about those two terms? Okay. So Carney triad is one of the tumor predisposition syndromes. It's really defined by the occurrence of GIST, paraganglioma, and pulmonary chondroma. Paraganglioma is a tumor you may not have heard of before. It's a tumor of nerve cells, and it occurs in the neck, chest, or abdomen. And it's often, but not always, benign, meaning it doesn't spread anywhere. It's just in that one location. And if it's removed surgically, usually that's sufficient treatment. Pulmonary chondroma is a cartilage tumor that occurs in the lung and generally is benign. And then the GIST that happens in Carney triad tends to occur in the stomach and tends to be what we call multifocal, meaning that at the time that it first occurs, it occurs at several locations in the stomach rather than just one tumor. The age of tumor development in Carney triad is between the teens and the 30s, so it's a form of pediatric GIST. It's not inherited, and we don't yet know the cause. And most of the people with Carney triad are female, girls. And I'm going to draw this kind of Venn diagram where I relate all of these different types of wild-type GIST. The next tumor predisposition syndrome is called Carney-Stratakis dyad. In this syndrome, there are two tumors that occur together. They're similar to the Carney triad, but different in that there's no pulmonary chondroma. So this is just GIST and paraganglioma together. Again, in this syndrome, the GIST tends to be in the stomach and tends to be multifocal. And the age of tumor development, this is a relatively recently recognized syndrome, so we don't know we're not entirely clear about the age of tumor development, but we think that it's in the teens and to 30s. And a recent discovery is that this is caused by a mutated form of succinate dehydrogenase in all of the cells of the body, and therefore this is something that can be inherited. But the severity of the Carney-Stratakis dyad varies, so that there might be tumors in the grandparent, and the mother and the child don't get any tumors. So you can have the gene abnormality in your body, but not get any tumors. Okay, and so Carney triad and Carney-Stratakis dyad, we think, are two distinct types of wild-type GIST. So then to move on to pediatric GIST, we don't really know how to define this, so we've just defined it by age. And we basically say that it's GIST that's diagnosed at age 18 or less. Again, this GIST is commonly, but not always, multifocal at the time of diagnosis. When children get GIST, only 15% of the time will their tumor have mutations in KIT or PDGF receptor alpha. So most children who get GIST have the wild-type form of GIST. So far, we're not entirely clear about the cause of pediatric GIST that doesn't have the KIT or PDGF receptor alpha mutations. But recently, we've discovered that some patients, childhood patients with GIST, will have a mutant form of the SDH gene in all of the cells of their body. We're not clear yet what percentage of children with GIST have that. We think it's about 15%. They generally, because it's not the Carney-Stratakis dyad, these are children who don't have paragangliomas themselves and don't have a family history of paraganglioma. But we actually think that they may have sort of a variant of Carnes Stertachus dyad, and so we actually watch these patients for the development of paraganglioma. We have to monitor for that. And very often, no one else in the family has GIST or a paraganglioma. And then one thing that we've also recently discovered is even in those children who have GIST and don't carry that abnormal form of SDH in all the cells of their body, the tumor itself has had an abnormality in the SDH gene. It doesn't work properly. So when we talk about children with GIST, they can have just pure pediatric GIST. They can have Carnes Stertachus dyad, or they can have Carney triad. And then moving on now to wild-type GIST, which I'll really talk about as being GIST occurring in adults that lacks mutations in KIT or PDGF receptor alpha. This is only 15% of adults who have GIST. The cause of these, many of them are unknown. Some of the tumors will have something called a BRAF mutation, which you may have already heard about from previous speakers. And this is a mutation in the tumor, not in all the cells of the body. So it's not passed on to, it's not inherited. And it turns out that some young adults, those in their early 20s, and actually we think now it can also be older adults, that have the wild-type form of GIST can have a mutant form of SDH in all the cells of their body. And again, these people with wild-type GIST with the SDH mutation may not have paragangliomas, and they may not have anyone else in the family with GIST or paraganglioma. Okay, so this is sort of the Venn diagram of the types of GIST that I just told you about. And what's sort of become clear to us over the last couple of years is that abnormal SDH may be a common feature of all of these types of GIST. So what is SDH? So SDH is part of the electron transport chain. I don't expect you to know what that is. What the electron transport chain does is it helps your body use oxygen in the process of converting food to energy. And what we know about SDH is that when it's abnormal, cells don't use oxygen properly, and that seems to promote cancer, certain types of cancer development, primarily the GIST, the paragangliomas. It turns out that there are some other tumors that are not related to GIST or SDH that also result from the inability to use oxygen correctly, and probably the most well-known and well-researched of these is renal cell carcinoma. So now moving on to the natural history and treatment. So in terms of the pediatric forms of GIST, most of them appear to have a slower pace of disease. So even in, if someone was diagnosed with GIST when they were young, they tend to have a slightly higher chance of having disease that's spread or metastatic. But in that situation, it seems as though the tumors don't grow as quickly as what we see in the sort of KIT and PDGF receptor alpha mutant form of the disease. In terms of treatment, with imatinib, sunitinib, and other drugs, we know something about how imatinib and sunitinib work in adults with wild-type GIST due to a lot of research done here by George and Jonathan, which is that imatinib does have some effect, but it's not quite as good for those GIST that have no KIT or PDGF receptor alpha mutations. But still, 45% of people with the wild-type tumor will have tumor shrinkage with imatinib. Sunitinib, again, not as effective at shrinking tumors, but it does seem to stop growth for a prolonged period of time. So they're both drugs that we do use in the wild-type GIST. In terms of the pediatric patients themselves, so those things that I told you about are really from studying GIST, wild-type GIST in adults. When we look at children who have wild-type GIST, we actually know very little about how the drugs work. So we looked at some patients who had received these drugs because they really were having growth of their GIST, and we didn't have any other treatment options for them. And it turns out that sunitinib seems to have the same effect in children with GIST as it does in the adults who have the wild-type GIST. It seems to stop growth for a prolonged period of time. So, then we need to ask the question, because these tumors are different in the way that they form or in what causes them to form, are there other treatments that we might think about using that aren't the same as the ones that are used in the adult GIST? So the first thing that we thought about is something called insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor. This is a a receptor tyrosine kinase like KIT or pediatric receptor alpha that's on the surface of tumor cells. And it turns out that pediatric and wild-type GIST have high levels of this IGF-1R in their cell surface. Many other cancers also have high levels of IGF-1R. There are not mutations present in that. Insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor is involved in normal growth, and it's known to stimulate cells to sort of grow and divide. Previously, there were many antibodies and drugs directed against IGF-1R that were in development, but it turns out that they weren't that effective in cancers like breast cancer and that sort of more common cancers than GIST. And so now there are very few drugs in development. But we continue to investigate opportunities for treatment studies in young patients with GIST using these IGF-1R drugs that are in development. And then we are thinking about whether we might learn lessons from other tumors that result from the inability to use oxygen correctly, such as renal cell carcinoma, where there have been a number of studies looking at tyrosine kinase inhibitors similar to the ones that are active in the adult GIST, but different, a little bit different in how they act. And so we're thinking about whether or not it might make sense to study some of those drugs in the pediatric GIST and wild-type GIST. So in terms of other research efforts, we have sort of a collaboration of researchers and clinicians who are very focused on pediatric and wild-type GIST, and we all work together through something called the NIH Pediatric and Wild-Type GIST Clinic, and we're working to better understand the sort of features of this disease and the treatment. In terms of new therapies, we're thinking about whether or not we can develop one of these IGF-1R antibody or other drug type studies, and then also working on developing 2 different tyrosine kinase inhibitor studies, and particularly looking at those kinds of drugs that have activity in other tumors with abnormal oxygen metabolism. Then very importantly, we're working on better understanding the causes and the role of the SDH abnormality in pediatric and wild-type GIST, and there's several laboratories working on that. And then finally, an important component of what we're working on is educating clinicians, particularly pediatric oncologists, about this rare cancer, because people really need to understand that it behaves a little bit differently, that the cause is a little bit different, and that some of the considerations, some of the ways that we think about treatment are a little bit different than the KIT and pediatric receptor alpha mutant GIST that occur most often in adults. And so there are a couple of review articles and treatment guidelines that we're working on. So I'll actually take questions now because I'm on service and I have to run back to the hospital.
So I'm going to try to explain some of the genetics of the rare times, and they are rare, when the tendency to develop GIST is inherited. So genetics is everywhere. It's even on Life magazine, which doesn't exist anymore. But there are plenty of other genes in the news all the time. And we're going to think about this. Cancer is a genetic disease. So genetic in this case does not mean inherited. It just means that the genes in the tumor are really the problem. They're not so normal anymore as they used to be, and they're not regulated in a normal way, and therefore the cells don't behave normally, since genes are what give your cells instructions about what to do. So some genes are about structural things you have. Katie said genes are about who you are, but genes are actually only about physically what makes you. In your tumor, you still have all the same genes, but they're not as normal as they used to be. You'll remember chromosomes. Those are the long things that genes are organized on. Genes are made of DNA, and you can see on these diagrams, and there is a pointer someplace. Wow, it's even attached. Okay. So here's the cell. In the nucleus of the cell are the chromosomes. The chromosomes have the DNA, and you've seen these double helix things drawn before. And the DNA makes its instructions known by making protein. If there's a mistake in the DNA, then the proteins won't be normal. The DNA is made of this incredibly clever scheme of bases. There are only 4 bases, and they always are supposed to pair that A's go with T's, so all the pinks and yellows, and C's go with G's. And the whole human genome is made of these 4 base pairs in very specific order. So these are chromosomes. You might have seen pictures of chromosomes before. This is a normal male, if there is such a thing. And, oh, I'm sorry. I live with them.